In this lecture, we will review the importance of training evaluation. In other words, how to evaluate the effectiveness of a training program. So if we think about the general training process, there are four general phases or stages that we proceed forward with. We're trying to develop, implement, and then finally evaluate a training program. First, we begin with assessing training needs as part of a training needs assessment. And then we focus on how we can enhance learning within the training context and the learning environment. And to do so, we address the characteristics of the trainee and the organizational context and how they interact with the training itself. And then next, we move on to choose and administer an appropriate training method or multiple types of training methods, such as lecture or simulation, or whatever might be appropriate for training the KSAOs, the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, competencies, and or behaviors that the training program is intending to teach people. Today, we're going to focus on the final phase of this training process, which is to evaluate a training program's effectiveness. Hence the title, Training Evaluation. So what is the importance of training evaluation? Why should we care about it? Well, it's important to evaluate whether a training program actually worked. Now, that is, we want to know, did the training program improve the measures of training effectiveness or outcomes that it was supposed to improve? Now, this might seem like it's rather straightforward and that every organization would evaluate a training program, but this is not often the case. Unfortunately, training programs are not always evaluated as well as they should be, and in some cases, they're not evaluated at all. Now, this is they're not evaluated or they're not evaluated as well as they should be, even though many training programs can be quite expensive to develop and to implement, and they're time consuming for trainees to take part in, as well as time consuming for managers to help support their employees that are going through the training program as well. And it often takes people away from their day-to-day work as they engage in a training program as a training participant or trainee. Now, further, some organizations are going to lack the in-house data analytic KSAOs, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that are needed to measure training outcomes and to evaluate the training program's effectiveness. And so what do I mean by data analytic KSAOs? Well, I mean things like knowledge of research design and knowledge of statistics, for example. Now, in this lecture today, we're going to focus on, as part of this lecture, knowledge of research design, and I'll show you a few different types of research designs that are commonly used in the training evaluation context. So let's now start with measures of training effectiveness. And what do I mean by that? Well, measures of training effectiveness are essentially what are we measuring in terms of the KSAOs, the competencies, or the behaviors that we hope people will learn as part of the training program, and how do we go about doing that, and what types of measures might we use? So perhaps the most common type that you'll see is what are called reactions measures of training effectiveness. And so what do we mean by reactions? Well, in this context, we mean the extent to which the training program was liked or considered relevant to the job by the trainees themselves. So in other words, we often ask people questions like, how much did you like the training? Or to what extent did you like the training? Or maybe just simply a yes or no question, did you enjoy the training program? And did you find it relevant to your job? Now, these are important things to inquire about with the trainees because it is important for people to definitely not dislike and hopefully even like the training program and find it enjoyable and engaging. However, just because someone enjoyed something or liked something doesn't necessarily mean that they learned much or anything during that training program. So that's important to consider as well. Now, if we consider another type of measure of training effectiveness, we move on to perhaps a better indicator of training effectiveness, which is learning. And so what do we mean by a learning measure in this context? Well, we mean any kind of measure that has a demonstration of whatever the new KSAO competency or behavior from training is, and a person's proficiency level in that new KSAO competency or behavior. So were they able to learn what they were supposed to learn in the training context? And often these are assessed via things like tests or quizzes and things like that that appear either during the training, maybe after specific modules, or at the very end of the training program itself, that are meant to tap into and see to what extent can people demonstrate that they have these new KSAOs, competencies, or behaviors. Now, the next level up, we have what are called behavior measures. Now, behavior measures start getting into the territory of things that upper level leadership within an organization are going to immediately or more readily identify the value of and see how it relates to the organization's objectives, strategy, and mission, and so forth. That's because behavior measures refer to changes to on-the-job behaviors learned from training. So what this means, this is really all about taking what you learned during the training program and then transferring it via the training transfer process to actual behavior back on the job, in which the training was, from the beginning, intending to train people on certain KSAOs, competencies, or behaviors that needed training. So maybe these were things that, as part of that needs assessment and the job analysis and the person analysis, these were those areas and those training objectives and goals that were identified that identified deficiencies or gaps in what the employees should be able to do on the job and what they're actually able to do on the job in terms of their KSAOs, competencies, or behaviors. So we do want to see often a measure of behavior back on the job. We want to see how well are people able to perform the job. And one example of this is using an existing performance appraisal or evaluation tool, for example, especially if one of the performance dimensions closely relates to what was intended to be trained in the training program itself. Now, at the highest level, and what is perhaps most convincing to many different stakeholders within the organization, are results measures of training effectiveness. And these are ones that tend to be most compelling for leaders of the organization, as these tend to be linked to changes in key performance indicators or key organizational indicators of performance. And so these include things like if we see changes in profits from before to after the training program, or if it's a safety training program, we see a reduction in injuries, accidents, near misses, and things like that. These are what we've often called kind of the hard outcomes, or the criteria that are going to be are those criteria that we consider to be more objective in nature. So again, the 4 different measures of training effectiveness are reactions, learning, behavior, and results. The higher you move up in these in terms of going from reactions all the way up to the results at the top here, often the more convincing the evidence is going to be for different stakeholders, especially those at higher levels of the organization, when it comes to convincing or showing them how effective a particular training program actually was. So in terms of measures of training effectiveness, they should really be linked to training goals and objectives that were given to the trainers and trainees at the beginning of the training program or prior to the training program, as well as what they were reminded of throughout the training program. And so if you wrote very clear training goals and objectives, then usually it becomes a little bit more straightforward in terms of what measures of training effectiveness you're actually going to select. Now, and so in general, this can help you identify, if you are going to try to identify a results measure of training effectiveness, what that might actually be, as well as if it's behavior based and specific, and also if you go down to learning and reactions measures of training effectiveness, it'll also give you a good idea of that as well if you have really good training goals and objectives. So make sure that you link those things together. Now, during a training evaluation, we really should assess the extent to which the training and goals were met by using the chosen measures of training effectiveness and an appropriate research design. So we're going to embed these measures of training effectiveness within an appropriate research design, and this helps us figure out to what extent are changes or differences in these measures of training effectiveness attributable to the training program itself. And so we'll talk more about research design now. So what do we mean by research designs? Well, in the context of training evaluation, a research design refers to the strategy used to determine what measures of training effectiveness should be administered, when they should be administered, and whether any comparison, or in other words, control groups should be used or will be used. So some common training evaluation research designs include the following, and these are just the ones that we're going to focus on today. First, post-test only without a control group, so without a comparison group. Pre-test, post-test without a control group. Post-test only with a control group, and pre-test, post-test with a control group. So here's a fun fact for you. A true experimental design requires a control group and random assignment to the trainee groups. So for example, a training versus a control group. So those people who receive the training program and those people who do not. There would be random assignment to them in terms of the trainees. So that's how we would distinguish a true experimental design, say, from a quasi-experimental design. So let's start and dig a little bit deeper into these different types of research designs that we use in the training evaluation context. And so let's start with what's called the post-test only without control group design. So as you can see here, we can use this type of diagram here to demonstrate what a post-test only without control group design looks like. So you can imagine you have your trainees, all of them go through the same training program, and then after the training program, and you can see here above, time is flowing in this direction from left to right. After the training program, everybody gets a post-test. And so what happens during the post-test? That's where whatever measures of training effectiveness you've selected, you give them to the trainees after they've completed the training program. So we can also think about this a different way too. We can look at this visually in this way. So let's imagine a plot here where we have on the x-axis when the test is given. So in other words, when the measures of training effectiveness are given, pre-test, post-test. And so you can imagine the training is taking place sometime here. If you think about this as being time here, where time is flowing from left to right. And then on the y-axis, we have measures of training effectiveness. So if we have a post-test only without control group design, then we would just have the training group here. And so here the training group is represented by this green triangle, and you see that there's only a post-test here. Okay, so there's only one group, everybody participates in this training group, and here is their level of performance on whatever measure of training effectiveness is here. Maybe it's a results-based measure of training effectiveness. And so this doesn't mean a whole lot by itself, but let's say that the organization does have a threshold where they need everybody to score above a certain level. So maybe it's a fire safety training module or something like that. Then if the average score here for the training group is above that threshold, then we'd perhaps conclude, okay, this training is fine. But what don't we know here? Well, this is one of the least rigorous types of research designs in the training evaluation context because it does not provide evidence of whether the outcome or any level of a measure of training effectiveness is actually attributable to the training program itself. People could have come in with this level of this particular outcome, whatever this measure of training effectiveness is, they could have been at this level prior to the training. So if we were to imagine where they started, this could just be a horizontal line here over time. They maybe didn't learn anything from the training. They already knew what they needed to know beforehand. And this might only be appropriate to use this type of design, or commonly the times that when you would see this type of design are in instances in when it really isn't of concern whether trainees actually learn something from the training. The only thing that's of concern is whether or not the trainees scored high enough on that whatever measure or measures of training effectiveness that are important. Sometimes this is for regulation purposes and things like that, but that's pretty much the only context in which this would generally be an accepted approach here in terms of a research design. So let's move on to a little bit more rigorous design. Well, let's talk about a pre-test, post-test without control group design. And so here you see this represented visually here. So instead of just having a post-test after everybody goes through the training program, if we look over here earlier in time, we give everybody a pre-test. So they take the pre-test, they engage in the training, and everybody engages in the post-test. So what takes place during the pre-test? Well, it's ideally going to be the exact same measure of training effectiveness that you give everybody in the post-test. You're just giving it to them up front too. This gives you a baseline. So you have something to compare the post-test scores to. So let's look at that a different way, using the same plot that we saw before here. So as we had before, you have a green triangle represents those people that went through the training group, and this is their average level on the measure of training effectiveness that we've selected here. Now, If we give them a pretest, now we have that baseline. And so let's imagine that this is the pretest value here. And so we can see that, at least visually, there is an increase or a positive change in time from pretest to post-test on whatever measure of training effectiveness this is. So this gives you a baseline. It lets you know where people started, okay? And statistically, if you wanted to evaluate this and identify whether or not this is a statistically significant change, one type of inferential statistical analysis you could use is a paired samples t-test here. Now, this is a more rigorous research design than the post-test only without control group design that we saw just a bit earlier. And that's because it includes that baseline measurement occasion, which is the pretest. Okay, so we get an idea of where people started on average. Now, what is this design deficient in? Well, it lacks a comparison group, or in other words, it lacks a control group by which to compare if that direction of change and the amount of change from the pretest to the post-test actually differs from a group that did not receive the focal training program or that received a different training program. So we don't know if this positive change, for example here, is attributable to the training program itself. It could be just the result of natural learning and maturation. So let's imagine that this training program, more specifically, is an onboarding program to help socialize new employees into the organization to improve their role clarity, their self-efficacy, and their feelings of acceptance into the organization. Well, if you think about this onboarding program maybe lasting 6 weeks, well, you might not actually know with this type of design if people were actually learning anything from the formal onboarding training, or if they were just learning from working the job and meeting people and networking outside of the onboarding training. Okay, and so that's one of the major limitations of a pre-test, post-test without control group design. You don't have a group that did not participate in the training program with which to compare those people who did participate in the focal training program. So let's now add a layer of rigor to this and get into the territory of what we typically would call quasi-experimental designs. And if we were to do random assignment here to the training at the control group, then we could get into the territory of calling this a true experimental design within the organizational context. And so as you can see here, now we have it's a post-test only with control group design, which means everybody gets the same post-test. And so this is your measure of training effectiveness. They get it after the training program. There's no pre-test here in this design. But instead of having just everybody going through the training program, the focal training program, you also have a control group. And that means that people that either go through a different training program, maybe the old training program, or they don't go through anything at all. They don't receive any type of training. This is now your comparison group here, this control group. So let's take a look at this on this plot to get a better idea of what it means. So if you recall, with the post-test only without control group design, we just knew where the average score was for that training group in terms of their measure of training effectiveness after they completed the training program, so the post-test. Well, with a post-test only with control group design, now we have the control group as represented by this blue circle here. Now we can see after the training group has gone through the training program and after the control group people have done whatever the control is, whether or not there's differences afterwards on that post-test measure of training effectiveness. And so here visually you can see that, well, at least it looks like there is an observable difference here. If you wanted to test whether or not this is a statistically significant difference here, you would use perhaps an independent samples t-test. Now, what we don't yet know, though, is where these people started. So where did the people in the training group start and where did the control group start? So again, we don't know whether this difference was the result or attributable to the training program itself, or if it was actually a pre-existing difference and the training really had very little or not much to do with it at all. So a post-test only with control group design tends to be a more rigorous research design than a post-test only without control group design because it does use a comparison group, and that is your control group, okay? So we have a reference point here. We have a reference group. However, it does lack a baseline or a pre-test measurement, which means we don't know where the trainees initially started, as I mentioned before. So now let's move on to the fourth example of a commonly used training evaluation design. And so let's focus now on it being a pre-test, post-test with control group design. And so just as we saw before, we have a post-test here that everybody receives, which is the post-test measure of training effectiveness. As we just saw with the last design, we also have some people, approximately half the people get the training, about, let's say, half the people get assigned to the control group. And then the difference is that we give everybody a pretest, which again, the pretest is going to be hopefully the same measure of training effectiveness we give to people at post-test. We're just giving it to them prior to engaging in the training or into the control condition so that we can establish a baseline. So let's take a look and see what this looks like here. So again, if you were just doing a post-test, if you're doing a post-test only with control group design, you'd have your training group, and you'd have your control group, and you could see whether or not there were differences post-training and post-experience in the control group. However, if you add a pretest to this, now you can start to figure out where were people at baseline. And so this is to illustrate here visually this example of why it's so important to assess people using a pretest and what additional information you can gather. As you can see here, if we were only looking at a post-test design with a control group where there was no pretest, you would maybe conclude that the training was effective, that there are differences after training. However, in this example, if we included a pretest to this, we find that perhaps, well, actually, the rates of change or how they change from pre to post test in each one of these groups is approximately similar. These lines, or in other words, are relatively parallel to one another. And so what this is signaling to us is that probably the training didn't have much effect here, if any. These were maybe pre-existing differences that people had from the start, and that the increase you see here was maybe due to outside forces. It was due to outside learning. Perhaps it's because the training itself wasn't effective, but both groups, because they were exposed to the pretest, which had measures of training effectiveness, that cued them into what was important. And maybe when they're back on their job in between training sessions, they were Googling it, they were looking it up in the company's wiki to try to figure out how they could do better on that. And so they naturally, over time, on average, improved, but not necessarily due to the training itself. So what this would tell you is maybe the training is not a good investment, or it should be redeveloped and redesigned in order to actually make there be differences in terms of rate of change from pre-test to post-test between the training group and the control group. So what we would hopefully like to see, and this is why we do a pre-test often, is to make sure that both groups are comparable or roughly equivalent prior to engaging in either the training or the control. Okay, and so this is what we would love to see here, is that both groups, their average scores on the measure of training effectiveness are approximately the same prior to engaging in the training program. So then we can be more confident that any differences we see, any differences in terms of rate of change from pre-test to post-test, is likely attributable, at least in part, to the training itself. Okay, now, how would we go about evaluating this using an inferential statistical analysis? Well, there's different types of approaches you could use. One would be to do what's called an ANCOVA, analysis of covariance. And another approach you could use would be to do a 2x2 mixed factorial ANOVA, or a 2x2 mixed factorial analysis of variance, if we were to spell out ANOVA in that way. So we're talking about a pre-test, post-test with control group design. What's notable is that it includes both a baseline or pre-test measurement occasion, and it also includes that control group, which can help strengthen our inferences about the training program's actual effectiveness. And this is a big benefit potentially over other types of designs that we've talked about thus far. Now, one thing I want to point out, though, about the pretest is that a pretest might actually lead to what we sometimes refer to as a practice effect for both the training and control groups, which could cloud inferences about the training program's actual effectiveness, or in other words, how much we see changes actually attributable to the training program itself. Okay. Again, people see the measure of training effectiveness prior to the training. That might affect how they approach the training itself. And some might argue this is actually a good thing. If they're tuned in to the training program, they've seen what they're going to be assessed on, maybe that'll motivate them to perform better. So what are some additional considerations when it comes to training evaluation and considering different types of research designs? Well, one thing that I haven't talked about yet is the length of time before or after the training at which you're going to actually administer those post-test measures or pre-test measures of training effectiveness. Okay? And so what I mean by that is if you're going to give a post-test, for example, are you going to give it one day after everybody completes the training, 1 month after, 1 year after? What makes the most sense here? And so obviously people are typically going to retain the most in terms of knowledge 1 day after training as compared to 1 year. But what is more realistic in terms of what they're able to actually transfer to the job? So think carefully about the length of time, that interval of time between when the training completes and when you actually measure training effectiveness. And likewise, consider when you're going to give that pre-test as well. Now, also consider the number of times before and or after the training that you are going to administer those training measures of effectiveness. And the reason that you want to consider that is that in these examples so far, I've just been showing you one pre-test and one post-test measurement occasion. But conceivably, and sometimes in practice, an organization might do multiple pre-tests, maybe one that's a month before training, one that's a day before training. And the reason for that can be to assess whether there's stability in the KSAOs or the behavior or competency or whatever it is that the training is trying to assess, to see whether or not that's something stable. And so that can be a way to get an idea of where people are actually starting, is you can kind of look at the average across multiple measurement occasions prior to people engaging in the training program. Now, alternatively, you can do the same thing after training in terms of having multiple measurement administrations of those measures of training effectiveness. And the reason you might do this is to actually assess learning decay. So to see how long do people retain the knowledge, the skills, the behaviors that they learned in training after the training program completes? Because what you might see is that you see higher levels one day, 1 week post-training, but if you get to 6 months or 1 year, you see lower levels on those measures of training effectiveness that you administered before. Now, another consideration is whether or not a control group is ethical given the nature of the training content. Now, think about what you're doing here. When you're putting people into a control group, you're withholding what you think is going to be likely the better option. The new training program, or if there was no training program to begin with, you're giving them something that if you put any thought into it, develop good training programs, use good appropriate training methods, it's likely going to help people at least a little bit. Now consider what that means to withhold one group of people and put them into a control group while another group is getting this added benefit. So especially if it's something like safety, if you're trying to teach people on safety attitudes, behaviors, and performance, that might be very unethical to withhold such a training that could actually literally save people's lives in the workplace, and to withhold that from a control group of people and to give a different group of people, the training group, access to something that could save people's lives. Now, one way you might get around this is if it's a very short training, is that let's say it's a 1-day safety training, you give the training group that training the first day, and then you give everybody the post-test, and then the very next day you might give the control group that training just to catch them up in case it's effective. Now, the final consideration I'll point out, and there are many additional considerations you could consider here, but this is one I think is important, is whether or not a true experiment is possible or practical in your organization and with this specific type of training that you're trying to evaluate. Now, the reason I bring this up, if you recall, a true experiment has not only a control or a comparison group, it also has random assignment to the training group and to the control group. And the reason we do this is in part to make sure that there are no pre-existing differences at baseline or pre-test. If you randomly assign people demographics and the other types of information, as well as levels on those initial measures of training effectiveness, are typically going to be more similar. And so to have a true experiment, you need to have both random assignment and a control group. However, think about whether or not this is practical. if everybody is going back to the same, if this is a multi-day training that's only a few hours a day and everybody returns to their workstations in between, and you've randomly assigned people from the same office space to either the training or the control, what you might find is that when people go back after each training session, they might chat about it. And so those people that received the training might actually start educating those people that received the control. Now, this is probably a good thing, but if you're trying to establish how good the training program actually is, this is probably not going to be very effective. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll take naturally occurring groups and not do random assignment and say, okay, we have two facilities. We have a Portland and a Beaverton facility. We're going to assign the Portland facility to the training group and the Beaverton to the control group. And that way, at least there's less intermingling during the training itself between the control group participants and the training group participants or trainees. So just something else to consider as you're considering how to evaluate your training program. So here are some of the sources that I cited and referenced in today's lecture. And this wraps up the lecture on training evaluation.